Now, most resumes will end with that education and certification section. And some people will say, like, in the old days, you'd put references available upon request, or some people might attach a separate sheet with their references, particularly they're asked right in advance for references. But that's typical. It can vary, I know, but it's typically not done. So a lot of times don't put that, just waste space as far as listing like resume references available upon request or anything like that. So a lot of times you'd end with that education and certification. But again, this document is made to help sell you and give people reason to want to interview you. So you could add additional section below that education certification, optionally if you want. And here's some examples of what that might be. So for example, you could have just a little thing that says languages, or language fluency, whatever it might be. And then you could list the languages, just bullet point out, English, Spanish, French, whatever the language is. Because with languages, that can be very, very powerful. So if you speak more than one language, congratulations, well done. That's very good. And so list those out. Find a place to list them. This is where you can actually do this in additional section. And two things happen with that. Well, sometimes an employer is really looking for somebody who has multiple, is bilingual or can speak multiple languages, and they're calling for that. They're putting that right in their job description. So you want to make sure you highlight there that the machine can scan for. That's number one. But number two, even if they're not at all, even if they're not looking for multiple languages, the fact that you speak multiple languages just makes you seem smarter, more dedicated, more that you've invested in you, or maybe you grew up speaking both languages. Either way, it's like, oh, look, that's interesting. That person speaks multiple languages. Maybe we could use that sometime in the future. Maybe someday we'll expand into Spain and this person speaks Spanish. So maybe someday, that person might help us out over there. You never know. Either way, it kind of gives that whole feeling of like, this is an interesting person. I might want to talk to him. Additional section, you could put like publications, things that you've written, or patents that you've developed. Those are things that you can put in there too as well, in an additional section. You could call it just publications. If you've got multiple things like languages, publications, patents, you could list them all out, languages, and then list them, and publications, list them. Or you could make them a catch-all type category of, of additional information, or additional experience, whatever it might be, and then you list those different things out. Another thing that can go in here sometimes is volunteerism. Certainly your LinkedIn page, you might talk a little bit about volunteerism, where you volunteer, help out. From a resume standpoint, I wouldn't list it unless it's something that might be, where somebody could say, well, that links to the job position, or maybe you're in a leadership role or whatever. Or if it's something certainly that's not controversial, that's fine, it tells your story. But remember, the resume is trying to get you to the job interview. That's the whole point, right? So certainly if you're going to put something for a volunteer, that's great. You can list it. But don't, take from other spots like your work experience to just say, I volunteer, or I volunteer at these certain organizations. Again, certainly if the organization is non-controversial, because the person you're interviewing with, you don't know their viewpoints. You may not necessarily agree or disagree with their viewpoint in the work environment. Certainly a lot of times things are talked about, but you're just trying to get to the job interview, and then from there you can decide whether you want to accept the job. And it'd be, think through that too. Like you might have an example like, well, I'm involved with saving the whales, right? I want to save the whales, and I'm an active volunteer, or maybe I I have a leadership role. I'm on the board of directors for the Save the Whale Foundation. You think, gosh, who would want to save the whales, right? That seems so easy. That sounds great, right? Well, there are people who don't want to save the whales. There are people who kill whales and eat whales. So if you're, somebody, if you might be applying to a company that, does whale harvesting, they have ships and go out and, Japan or wherever, and they do that. Or maybe you make the company you're applying to makes ships, and they sell ships to people who might hunt whales. Now, in the end, you might say to yourself, I would never work for a company like that, obviously. But at this point, you might not even know what the connections are, by the way. It might be a company that makes metal pieces or ball bearings, and their largest company happens to be a ship manufacturer for the whaling industry. So when in doubt, you leave it out or whatever. Like same thing with like cigarette smoking. Like you might be an anti-smoker volunteer, right? And organize parades and marches. But if you're applying for a cigarette company, you're never going to get hired. But again, you don't necessarily know all those connections. So just be careful with that. But if you have some good volunteer experience, particularly things that might talk about you as a leader, or again, you could put your accomplishments about how maybe you grew donations or grew fundraising or something that's measurable, that can be in here too as well and tells your whole story. Now, for the person you're applying to, you've looked at their LinkedIn profile, like it's small or medium company, you know a little bit about them. Maybe you're sending something directly and you see that they're very involved in a particular cause, and so are you, maybe in a different part of the country. Put that in your cover letter, put that in your email to them. You can put it in your resume here at the bottom too as well. So because once again, you might have that instant connection with them. Though later in the interview process, somebody else might have a different opinion, for sure. All right, so these additional sections, you don't have to list them at all, but I think if there's something, especially like a language, publication, patent, and some volunteer things, those are the type of things that can really stand out. This is not LinkedIn where you're going to talk about your hobbies or something like that. This is all about getting you a job. So always think about it from that perspective. Let's start looking at some examples now and see how we can build our resume and some cool tools we can use to help build resumes coming up.